Hey, this is Joel Duff, and I just got done watching an Answers in Genesis video. Yeah, why do I do that to myself? Yeah, I've asked myself that too, because I didn't learn anything new. Did I expect to learn anything new? I don't think so. But I'm always intrigued by the gradual morphing or mutating of the story as multiple different speakers from Answers in Genesis continue to deliver the same message, especially speakers that have no background sort of in it. All they've ever known is Answers in Genesis material. They don't know the original source material. And so it's always interesting to hear them sort of, take, even though they've been given a script, they've been sort of given the slides, the standard set of slides, and they've been getting the talking points. They can't help but sort of add on little things as they go. Like they don't realize that every time they speak, they sort of like twist the story slightly differently, exaggerate a little bit more. And so what happens is that the stories, the information becomes more and more outlandish or outspoken, or I guess over exaggerated over time. And so that's what I find interesting about this particular talk and the particular speaker that gave it. So let's dig into this. This really has to do with speciation and the loss of information, some common themes that we hear in Answers in Genesis talks. All right, so let's do it. Let's react to a couple screenshots of a recent Answers in Genesis talk given at the Ark Encounter by Dr. Jennifer Rivera. We got that coming on up. All right, so down here is the video that popped up in my YouTube suggested watches. Origins of Evolution Exposed. This video dismantles Darwinian evolution. Well, I gotta watch that. What could they say that would dismantle Darwinian evolution? And here we have Dr. Jennifer Rivera standing at the podium ready to give a talk at the Ark Encounter. So before we get into the slides, let's meet the speaker first. What do we know about her? So here's Dr. Jennifer Hall Rivera. She's the Director of Educational Programs, a speaker, and an author. She's been with Answers in Genesis for a couple years now. And you can see that she holds an education doctorate in curriculum and instruction, an MAT with a science concentration, and a bachelor's of arts in criminal justice. So she's had some science classes, but she's primarily an educator, somebody who deals with coming up with education curriculum, thus the position she holds at Answers in Genesis. So you might wonder why she's speaking at the Ark Encounter on the question of exposing Darwinian evolution and destroying Darwinian evolution when she's not an expert in that particular field. Well, I mean, most of the speakers at Answers in Genesis don't hold science degrees or have studied those particular fields. They simply are conscripted to be speakers and present information that they are provided, right? They've of course grown up and know the Answers in Genesis literature, but they also are the product of a large marketing effort on the part of Answers in Genesis in which they provide the slides, all the information, and they have a huge, I'm sure they have a huge bank of slides that they basically choose from in order to make presentations. Some of the presentations are so scripted that I've seen multiple speakers there who, like their zookeeper and several others, who get up and give essentially exactly the same talks. All right, they must be written out, but they never say them exactly the same way. They all have a tiny bit of freedom to sort of like riff off a few things there that are kind of like something they're especially interested in. But the point is that she doesn't own the material in the sense of really having a deep understanding of the background information that goes behind making these slides. She simply knows the basic story, right? She knows the basic, what she thinks are the facts, right? The real truth that is coming from Answers in Genesis, and she's telling it to the audience. They need speakers to do this because what they try to do is they try to have speakers there nearly every day so that people coming through the Ark Encounter or the Creation Museum have a place they can go where they can sit down and actually listen to a talk. And so it takes, that's a lot of talks. They're not always going to have content experts giving all those particular talks. Now, the first half of her talk is really just a history lesson in Charles Darwin, his trips to the Galapagos Islands, some of the observations he made, and then addressing the question, what exactly is natural selection? And it's not half bad. I can't complain a whole lot about what she says there. I mean, she's correct in her description of how natural selection works. And just a reminder that Answers in Genesis is a defender of the principle or the action of natural selection as a real phenomena that happens in the world. And I feel like I have to say that because the Institute for Creation Research, another young earth creationist ministry, denies really that natural selection is a force that can actually sculpt and shape organisms. But Answers in Genesis actually employs natural selection as a major mechanism for adapting organisms after and even before the flood. So the real question comes then in about halfway through her talk, in which she begins to get to the question of what are kinds, because of course she's talking about how all the kinds could fit on the ark, and then after the ark, how did we get the biological diversity we have today? And so she gets to this point in the talk where she shows this image in which she has, here's the ark, and then she asks the question, how many dog kinds were on the ark? And her answer is going to be, well, there was only one dog kind on the ark. And I think she thinks that a lot of her audience is going to think that, oh yeah, well, you got wolves, and you have coyotes, and you have foxes, and you have domesticated dogs, and so forth, and like, how did all those get on the ark? And she's going to say, well, they didn't all have to be on the ark. There only had to be two dogs on the ark, or two canines on the ark. They departed from the ark, and then they became all the ones we have today. And all this stuff I said about natural selection earlier, that's all stuff that could possibly explain how those two dogs became all the different species of dogs we have today. But never fear, that's not evolution. So we're not saying evolution happened. We're just saying natural selection happened. Now I'm stopping on this particular slide. I screenshotted this slide, not because of the arc per se, but these two questions I have here. And I always find this fascinating. It's like you got this artwork group, and they spend a lot of time thinking about their slides and presentations. I would say they're very professionally done, these talks. And yet sometimes I got to scratch my head. I was just like, what were they thinking when they drew this stuff? I mean, I know the young earth creationist literature, and since I know it, I'm like, this doesn't look like a representation of the pre-flood world. Like, what were they thinking when they were drawing this picture of the pre-flood world? Because here they have the ark. It's about, right, it's finished, and God is calling all the animals together to get on the ark, and then you see they're coming up 2 by 2 up the ramp to get on the ark. But look what's in the background. I see this huge mountain in the background. Now, if you read most young earth creationist literature, there weren't significant mountains before the flood. They believe they're rolling hills on a single continent. There wouldn't have been one of the reasons there weren't mountains before the flood, at least in their interpretation. And I don't mean interpretation of scriptures, because there isn't anything in the scriptures that talks about the lack of mountains before the flood, or that there were mountains before the flood. Basically scripture is kind of silent on that topic, but they infer that there weren't mountains before the flood because it's kind of handy, because otherwise you'd have to have the waters rise to extremely high levels over the whole face of the earth in order to cover the highest mountains. One way to not require as much water and make it more reasonable to believe that the world was covered with water is to not have mountains, right? So what you have is the seas, and you have low-lying, land, and that way it's easy to sort of cover the whole land and destroy the whole earth. And that's where you get films like After the Flood, or Mountains After the Flood by Is Genesis History. They're going to explain, well, where did mountains come from? Because there didn't used to be mountains. And mountains imply, really stark geographical differences in the world, and climate differences, because of course mountains create rain shadows, and it changed climate patterns, and there would be deserts, and there would be high altitudes with snow and so forth. And they don't visualize the pre-flood world that way. They view it as like one continent with kind of a consistent climate overall, because there weren't any disasters going on. So, all right, I just, maybe I'm weird, but I noticed little things like that in their presentations. Like, why are they showing a mountain when in their own literature, they talk about there not being mountains there before? At least if you're going to draw a picture and you're trying to be accurate, right? After all, can Ham complain all the time about bathtub arcs and how the ark is misrepresented and misshown, and that gives people false impressions, right? And that leads people, what you show people enters their minds, and that's their impression. But I find that Answers in Genesis all the time does the same thing. I don't know if they just don't think about what they're showing, but there is another thing in this picture. I don't know, it's like what was there? Massive deforestation before the flood? Almost every young earth creationist believes that this was a rather placid environment with plenty of water and lots of different organisms living there at the time. I mean, I guess you could say maybe he cut down all the timber around that area because he had to use it to build the ark, right? He deforested the land around it, but basically you have naked mountains and naked land as far as you can see, right? Really weird depiction of the pre-flood world. This is a very minor point, and I don't think we're not talking about Dr. Rivera having any being cognizant of this all. And she didn't talk about this in her talk. She simply showed this picture because she wanted to say this: how many dog kinds were on the ark? But I would just say she's oblivious to those sort of ideas and concepts of what that pre-flood world looked like. Okay, let's get to like the primary slide that I was struck by. I was not surprised when I saw it, but nonetheless, I still find myself perplexed as to why Interest in Genesis continues to, you know, ride this mantra of loss of information and tying it to organisms being larger and becoming smaller. This is where Dr. Rivera very, very clearly, and I rewound this and listened to it multiple times, because she talks about how she says, she just tells her audience, it's like so obvious. I mean, you just look at dogs, right? You look at dogs and you see poodles and you see other small dogs. And then you see wolves and you see other, and then coyotes that are simpler than wolves. And then you have African wild dogs that are smaller. And then you have collies, bulldogs, and other domesticated dogs. And you end up with a poodle. And obviously, anyone can see that a poodle has less information. It's like anyone can see it has less information. First of all, we've got the problem of, please, someone out there, younger creationists, send me a definition of what information is. What is she talking about? Because of course she didn't supply a definition for information. Like fewer genes, less complex genes. What's this information thing? Yeah, less information, and it's almost always tied to showing pictures of larger organisms becoming smaller, as if a smaller organism has less information. I think intuitively, the audience is going to say like, oh yeah, a bacteria has less information than a human being. Human beings are larger than bacteria, and therefore they need more information, again, not defined, more information in order to be larger or more complex than a bacteria. And so there's this temptation to say, like, to point to organisms like this, like these canines, and say like, the largest canine has the most information and the smallest one has the least amount of information. But the other thing I noted about her, and this is where her lack of understanding of biology really comes in, even understanding of the modern young earth creationist understanding of how organisms diversified. Because the young earth creationist view isn't that you start out with a wolf. Interest in Genesis has a picture on the ark of what the canine kind looked like on the ark. And it's actually a good bit smaller than a wolf. It's this small little animal that then diversified and changed into all the different species that included wolves and coyotes and African wild dogs and all the foxes and deagles and so forth. All right, and the gray foxes and the 36 different living species, and then like almost 100 other species that are extinct. And they didn't go from that original canine on the ark. Doesn't look like it has more information, because it's definitely not larger, and it doesn't have all the characteristics that you see in all those other things. That's not actually what you observe. Just from a layperson audience perspective, if you just laid out like, well, here's the original dog that was on the ark. Now look at all these other canines that exist in the world. Wow, they're incredibly diverse. They look like they're more diverse than the original canine. In fact, they look like they have more information, or that there is more information contained in all the different canines than there is in that one canine. Now, she talked about she gave the typical story, young Earth creationist story, which is God packed a ton of genetic information into that original canine dog. And so even though you couldn't see all the information, it was all there. They were incredibly information dense. Again, need a definition for information, but information dense, and then that information gets kind of scattered. But this is different than what this figure is showing and the way she talks about it. She specifically talked about the wolf losing information and therefore becoming coyotes and then wild dogs and then domesticated dogs. What evolutionary biologist, what biologist, what anybody thinks that African wild dogs gave rise to domesticated dogs? Doesn't everybody accept that domesticated dogs are just a variety, a subspecies of wolves? Right? They're just a population breakoff from wolves that have been highly selected for particular characteristics. I don't know anyone who knows that a wolf became lost information and became a coyote, and the coyotes lost even more information to become domesticated dogs. This doesn't even jibe with sort of the modern population genetics systematics of domesticated dogs, which I thought that young Earth creationists basically accepted the origin of the diversity of dogs from a common ancestor. She's saying the opposite. Didn't make any sense at all. But I see that she's not the only one that says that, right? She was provided this figure. Answers in Genesis folks say this all the time. There's a loss of information. Why are poodles so lacking in information? Show me the less information that they have. Provide me with a bunch of characteristics that poodles have and wolves have or coyotes have or collies, especially collies compared to poodles, and show me how they have less information. All right, I need a demonstration of that. You can't just say that as if it's just a truism. That's what these speakers do. It's like, look at that. And she's laughing about it. She's like, anybody could look at all of that. Obviously, poodles have less information. It's a nonsensical statement. All right, then she proceeds to show a figure of all these domesticated dogs. And she's trying to make the point that natural selection can draw upon and draw out variants from some original information-rich original ancestor that was on the ark. She's like, look at all this variation you can get. And part of her point is, again, she's using the naivete of the audience, who they all understand and know, and she knows that they know that all domesticated dogs, that they believe that all domesticated dogs are all related to one another. God didn't make Dalmatians and Golden Retrievers separately. They don't have separate origins. Everyone in that room, in her audience, believes that all these domesticated dogs came from a common ancestor. And so they're supposed to be wowed by the amount of differences they have. And then she's saying, look, all those differences were packaged in the original dog. Except that they weren't. All right. Many of the coat colors, many of the traits of like how they're holding their tails, whether their ears are standing upright or whether they're floppy, the length of their legs, right? Different physiological features that they have, right? Many of those features are actually unique to domesticated dogs. They may be unique to specific lineages of domesticated dogs because they're all mutations. Right now, she was talking about natural selection. She didn't not really talk about mutations. And she's trying to say that all this variation was in the original kind, except that it wasn't. Right? There's a ton of different variants that are mutations, that are clearly mutations that don't exist in wolves, the wild version of dogs, right? Canis lupus. They're mutations that have been selected for, yes, by selection, artificial selection. Human beings is like, oh, I like that new little character that just popped up. And it didn't pop up because it was hidden in the original wolf. And that wolf got it from the original ancestor on the ark. They got it because it was a mutation, a new variant that came into existence, was created in these particular domesticated dogs. And then we chose those particular characteristics. So we selected them because they were desirous to us. And so it's not just variance in genes, it's also variance in developmental things like gene regulation, upregulating, downregulating genes such that certain characteristics are displayed in different ways that aren't done in other organisms. You might think, well, isn't that just an environmental? No, that's actually a genetic change. That's actually a DNA change to control regions that control regulation. And so there are mutations. So this is what you're seeing in this picture is partly the pulling apart of variants that are found in wolves, right? And combining characteristics into packages, which we call like different breeds of dogs. It's partly that, but it's also partly brand new mutations and variations. And those mutations are they bad? I don't think you consider them bad because these dogs are very successful. There's an awful lot of poodles in the world, right? It's probably certainly there's more golden retrievers than there are wolves, right? And so they are, in one sense, you could say, more successful than wolves in this world. That those characteristics that they have, even despite some of the bad, the bad mutations they have, right? They have certain genetic diseases that are fairly common in golden retrievers, and they tend not to live as long. And yet there are more golden retrievers than there are wolves in the world. And so they are successful. Their particular package of genes is a very successful package of genes. All right, so again, I'm not how this is all dismantling evolution. Like the title really dramatic. Like you watch this and this destroys evolution. Yeah, I think she's trying to get across the idea that lots of change can happen. But of course she's going to say there's limits to it. In fact, she even says, like, you have to imagine there's like a wall there. And so one kind can't cross over to another kind because there's a wall. I'm like, what's the wall? Explain to me the wall. But she obviously doesn't know what that wall is. She just believes it exists. So believing a wall exists between two different kinds when you have trouble even defining what a kind is not exactly dismantling or destroying something, destroying an idea. But let's go on. We got so one other example, right? So then she goes on to explain how cats are doing the same thing. And she's taking this thing of you've got what looks to be a large complex species. And then you see how other species seem to have lots of less information, and that's the way of the world. You start out with complexity and lots of information, and then you lose information till you get domesticated cats. So she tells the same story, but with cats. And she says, again, I rewound so I could listen to it again. She says, you start with a lion, as if lions got off the ark, and then they degraded into Bengal tigers, which then gave birth to panthers, which gave birth to snow leopards, which gave birth to bobcats. Later, they gave birth to Norwegian cats, Sphinx cats, and eventually the rusty spotted cat or other domesticated cats after that. And this is all a loss of information. But this isn't even the way that Answers in Genesis portrays the evolution of felines, right? Did they start out as a lion, the largest animal with the most information inside of it? Here is the cat, all right? This is the feline that they have recreated, right? This is what they imagine the original cat looked like that was on the ark. And then you see behind it right there, there's this diagram. And it says like after the ark, and you can't see all of this figure, but after the ark, the offspring of these two cats that were on the ark, some of them, gave rise to a population that eventually lived in Africa and was the African wildcat, which then gave rise to domesticated cats. But a different population, like they had a litter of 10, and then 5 of them went one direction, 5 went the other direction, and those 5 mated with each other, and these 5 mated with each other, and those 5 eventually became things like ocelots and so forth, or other ones became like lions, and then other ones, another family from that split just a few generations later became cheetahs. This is not saying that you started with lions, the largest animals, and then you lost information in order to get down to the smallest ones. There's no hint of that here presented at the Ark encounter. And yet I hear this in their presentations over and over and over and over again. They show these pictures of decreasing information being related to a species lineage in which the largest species loses information to become the smallest one. Now, I'm sure what she would say is, if she recognized that she's not portraying that correctly, she would say, like, well, the most information is in this simple small cat. And it has the ability to give rise to a large cat, but also to a small domesticated cat. But that doesn't exactly sound the same as you start with a lion with the most information at all. All right, so here's the other image that is from, this is from a pamphlet you could buy at the Ark encounter that will help you. It's an educational guide for, this is for kindergarten to second graders, for them to help understand like where the cats came from. And you'll see there's the original cat, right? No, it didn't have to bring 2 of every animal. He only needed 2 of each kind. And in this case, the cat then has offspring, and some of those offspring become black panthers, and some of those cats become cheetahs, some of those offspring become cheetahs, and some become domesticated cats, and other ones become lions, right? So that simple cat then develops into a bunch of different characteristics, some of which display different sizes, right? Not that the largest side has the most information and the smallest one has the least amount of information. Yeah, so that's it. Every time I hear them talk about this particular slide, it just kind of like, I understand that their audience probably thinks this sounds really intuitive. It makes no sense biologically at all. Aside from just not having any clue what this information thing is, and no definition of that, to display large animals becoming small ones and going through a progression from wolves to coyotes to African wild dogs is completely contrary to the usual. Let me get my pen out here and I'll see if I can do this. Right? You have a common ancestor giving rise to a number of different canines, and eventually there's a common ancestor species that lives at some point. Let's say for young Earth creationists, 3,500 years ago. That's a population. That population divides in North America into some that are in one habitat that become the coyotes, right? So you have a population of coyotes, and you have another population of wolves, right? And then from that population of wolves, a few individuals eventually become domesticated to become another population of, well, all the different domesticated dogs, within which we have isolated many of those domesticated dogs into little genetic packages that we call the various breeds. I know my drawings are terrible. I need to use my pen thing instead of my mouse. I'm not very good with my mouse. All right, so you wouldn't say that wolves lost information to become coyotes, and then coyotes lost information to become domesticated dogs. When all of us think, I mean, really all of us, I think almost all young Earth creationists I've ever talked to that know any genetics at all and know anything about the history of dogs, fully understand that the genetics of domesticated dogs are a subset of the genetics of a wolf. They're not a subset of a coyote. Now, it's one thing to say, like, okay, well, there's this original population, and this wolf population happened to get more information, whatever information is, and coyotes got less information. And then, but from the coyotes, then they sort of gave a part of their genetic information to domesticated dogs, and so they have less information. And maybe poodles have the least amount of information, but size doesn't have anything to do with amount of information. That is surely a visual that is meant to have a lay audience believe something for which there is no underlying ground truth behind it. It's just a comforting saying and feeling like, oh yeah, right, this is what happens. Everything decays, information decays, organisms decay and become smaller. But if anyone knew any biology and thought about it for 10 minutes, they wouldn't come to that conclusion. I mean, what's the history of horses? According to young earth creationists, they show a little horse that was on the ark and eventually became larger horses that we have today. What about elephants? There was a smaller elephant, and now we have bigger elephants today that are descendants of that ark elephant. What about, let's see, what else do we have? Giraffes. You know that on the ark, what is depicted to be on the ark by Answers in Genesis is a short-necked, sort of okapi-looking thing, right, which is another species in the giraffe kind. Not the long-necked one that you know today, which is much, much larger than the one that they say was on the ark. The original kind that came on the ark then had had the information in order to grow this long neck that has these special features that allow it to be able to survive with that long neck and bend over and not pass out. All that had to be contained within the original giraffe kind, which would mean that more information in this fuzzy understanding of information they have, more information according to them should have been in the smaller giraffe, and today there's less information in the large giraffe. I think we could keep going on and on and on and on with other examples of this. So what is it with this large to small thing? Because it makes no sense according to their own descriptions of their own beliefs about the types of organisms that actually were preserved on the ark and then what their descendants became. All right. Yeah, let's quit there. That's my reaction to this most recent Answers in Genesis video by Dr. Rivera. Till next time. Yeah, we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.